thrown it down. We'd taken a case of water, put it right there, thrown our packs right against the edge of the dozer blade. And it was loud. I remember it was extremely loud at that point. Because that fire that was below us was just thunder, and it was jet aircraft on the tarmac screaming. I remember seeing just a big wall of fire hit the edge of our safety zone. I ducked down and I looked up. It sheeted. The sheet of fire just cascaded over the top of us, and can still hear it to this day. But boy, right after that, that radiant heat hit us, and it was just like yow, and it was to the point of it wasn't really wasn't skin searing hot. I don't know what skin searing hot is, but I can imagine. But it was hot like you're doing a burnout, and in the middle of the day you're burning out, and oh, I got to get away from that, and you just back off a little bit. But we had nowhere to back off to, and then the winds just really hit us at that point. I was actually one to say, hey, it's time, let's deploy our shelters. It was getting hot. I was on my knees behind the dozer blade, and my back was just really, really hot, like that hot I can't get away from. If I was out on the line or something, I would just turn my body and walk away from it. But I couldn't. I had nowhere to go. I was pinned to the ground. I was on my hands and knees, and my back was just arched up. I remember, and it was hot. It was getting real warm. I remember to the point I could smell my Nomex. I've been doing this long enough now. I know when I smell my Nomex starting to heat up, you can smell when it's warm, and that's where I was at. I was warm. And at that point, well, 3 deployed our shelters. In the shelter, I remember it getting hot, like sauna hot, if you will. I remember the air temperature just sauna hot. I remember I got into it, and thinking of, what you do now, thinking of training, made sure all my ground flaps were down. In the new shelters, we can't not have a ground flap down. It's almost like encapsulated, if you will, kind of compared to the old ones. Got in it and spread out, and we were talking and yelling. We were yelling back and forth at each other. We were right next, laying on top of each other, but yet it was loud. And it was starting to get some smoke, and I was talking, I'm really smoky in here, real smoky. And I think John said, I'm not too smoky, it's not too bad or something. And I couldn't figure out why it was so smoky. And for some reason I did this, and I looked, and there were embers that were blowing underneath. The wind was howling. Embers were blowing in underneath my ground flap. So I was actually putting embers out that were inside. That's what was creating all the smoke inside my shelter, was burning chunks of wood that were just smoldering in there and just filling it up. And I remember putting those out and shooting them to the side, and laid in the shelter, did the old, actually put the face down in the dirt. I was breathing like this for a few, because of the smoke that was in there, and not wanting to lift it up, thinking about all that stuff. And I remember my back getting hot again. My back and my right shoulder really is what it was. So what I had to do to accommodate that, I had to get on my left side, and I actually had to pull my feet in the kind of the semi-fetal position, and I had to pop the shelter off my back with my elbow. And my elbow would get hot, and I'd pull it down, and the shelter would lay back on me, and I'd pop it back up. And that actually seemed like an eternity. It really did. It seemed like a long time, but it wasn't. I remember John saying, hey, the truck's burning. I peeked, I looked, and I was laying with my back to the truck. So I didn't want to move, because I had that shelter that kept laying down on top of me and was getting hot. And John says, I can look at it, the rear tires are burning on it. I was like, oh no. I'm thinking, I'm not in a good spot right here. John got up. He said, I'm going to get up and go see if I can put it out real quick. And he says, my shelter, I watched the heat. And he says, no, I've already had my shelter. He said, lift your flap up, it gets cooler. And I went, what? And I reached up and I lifted the flap of the edge of the shelter up. I just lifted up about that far and just felt the cooler air come in versus that just hot air inside that shelter. Popped it open. I was like, ooh. And John then came right back. He says, it's not the truck, it's our gear. I was like, oh, the gear, really? At that point, I wasn't caring about the gear. he laid down and laid back down, crawled back in it, and passed some water bottles back and forth to each other. Drank some water. That was refreshing inside the shelter for sure. Some cool water. I had my canteen with me, again, training, but what I had done is I'd kicked that sucker down when I got in there. It's not perfect world by any means. I'd kicked it down, it was at my feet, and I couldn't get it. And when I did get it, I pulled it up to me, it was hotter than Hades. John and I both got up, left the shelter draped over us a couple times. Got a big buffet of wind. That stand larch, again, did this, snap, started snapping off. The winds were still heavy there. Laid back down. I remember rocks rolling through the deployment site. The biggest lesson learned for me really is weather directly related to the fuels. 5 days of red flag warning. It took 5 days of single-digit RHs for those 1,000 hours of fuels to react. On the 5th day, it succumbed to it. 5 days. That's a big, big, big lessons learned for me. I pulled the trigger a little bit earlier for me too now. My trigger points have moved. And people ask me all the time, well, how do you move your trigger points? And it's all situation dependent. And I pulled the trigger earlier a couple of times now. None of them have really, nothing ever happened, but I still pulled the trigger. I still got out of the way of something, 2 ridges instead of 1 ridge, if you will. Another big lessons learned for me is the thought of equipment versus the safety. I'm going to write off a piece of equipment again, plain and simple. That chunk of iron can be replaced. With my situation that I have right now under my belt, with the Tarkio burn over in my belt, if I'm ever around and have a crazy situation, I'll deal with the write-off of equipment. I'll front that battle, whatever comes to me. I honestly will. Fire shelter is just another tool of PPE to be utilized. And don't let the stigma of, oh my God, the fire shelter come out. That's honest. You know, that's a lessons learned too. Don't be afraid if you feel that you need to use that fire shelter because you have nothing else, no other avenues to, that's the last use. I used the last chunk of PPE on my back, and it worked. It worked like it was supposed to work. I'm here to talk about it.